Elden Ring's new DLC is so massive that personally, I think it might just qualify as one of, if not the greatest single DLC addition of all time for any game. And it's not just massive in terms of explorable land mass. To say it revealed more lore about the world would be a similarly massive understatement. There are lore bombs literally around every corner, and some of the biggest reveals that the community has stumbled upon so far have been regarding a certain god of the Erdtree that we know all too well, the mother of the demigods, Queen Marika the Eternal. In fact, I'd go so far as to say we know so much more about Queen Marika since the release of the DLC that her entire backstory is officially something we can fully understand. Well, okay, maybe not fully, because let's be honest, this is still a From Software game, but significantly more than ever before. Before we get into all of that though, I wanted to let you know that if you thought this video might have spoilers in it, you'd be correct. So consider this your one and only spoiler warning for the entire video. And as a heads up, we won't be going into too much detail regarding the story of Mikola, who we also get tons of info about because I just made a video on that very topic. So if you're interested in hearing the full story of the most fearsome Empyrean of them all and the gentler world that he would create, feel free to check out that video after you're done here. I'll leave the link in the description below. First things first though, since it has been over 2 years since the base game's release, let's make sure everyone's on the same page with just who the god Queen Marika is before going over the new discoveries from the Land of Shadow. And keep in mind that I'm not going to be going extremely in-depth regarding her lore from the base game for the sake of time, because that would probably make for an entire other video in and of itself, and there have already been tons of those videos made, one of which is right here on this channel actually. In a nutshell though, Marika is the current god of the Lands Between at the time that we enter the story, and is really the driving force behind pretty much everything. Well, she didn't create the world, or even the Elden Ring itself. That would be the work of the Greater Will, which is like the super god of all the gods that exists on the other side of the universe. But she is the one who created the Erdtree and used it to spread her grace throughout the land and bless all of her citizens, before eventually taking that same grace away from us, creating the Tarnished, which is what you and I are. But then she ended up giving it back to us once she shattered the Elden Ring, which, as I'm sure you know, is the physical and metaphysical set of runes that dictates the rules of the Lands Between. It's also the logo for the game, and it would probably make for a pretty cool tattoo idea now that I'm thinking about it. Marika also removed the rune of death from the Elden Ring when she became a god, consequently removing the concept of death itself from the world. She's also had at least 2 husbands who, as her king consorts, have both acquired the title of Elden Lord, the first of which was Godfrey, who had at least 3 demigod children with her named Godwyn and the twins Mohg and Morgott, and the second and current husband of which is Radagon, who had at least 2 demigod children with her, the twins Mikola and Malenia. Radagon also brought over his 3 children that he had with his previous wife Renala named Radahn, Rykard, and Ranni, who all became Marika's stepchildren. Marika also at some point literally became her husband Radagon, inhabiting the same body. And as a side note, I'm actually of the opinion that Radagon was at one point his own person, separate entirely from Marika, as proven by several different sources, but the best of which is actually some of her dialogue that we can hear Melina recite in the Queen's bedchamber. That really sounds like she was planning on merging with Radagon, but hadn't just yet.
In Marika's own words, O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both. Mine other self.
By the time we finally burn the Erdtree down and stand before Marika herself, she's been imprisoned inside her own body, inside the Erdtree, for her sin of shattering the Elden Ring, and remains motionlessly suspended in the air. Radagon then takes over and reveals that the Elden Ring is now inside his/her/their body, and then of course we fight mercilessly to the death. After which we fight the Elden Beast mercilessly to the death, and if we're successful, we then either repair Marika's broken body, aka the Elden Ring, or we destroy it entirely, depending on what we, the Tarnished Elden Lord, decide to do. For a long time, that was essentially everything we knew about Marika in a nutshell. But once the trailers for the DLC started coming out, as we all had hoped, we were given some additional intriguing pieces of information regarding Marika's past, such as the fact that she literally became a god in this new mysterious Land of Shadow, and that there was a, quote, seduction and betrayal involved with the entire event. We also learned that at the time she became a god and created the Golden Order, she subsequently sealed away the Land of Shadow for a reason that was not yet revealed to us. We also learned, due to an interview with Miyazaki himself, that she had yet another red-headed child known as Mesmer the Impaler, who was running around the place, impaling people in the Land of Shadow. And now that we're all on the same page with who Marika is, let's take a look at the new reveals in the Land of Shadow. To understand where Marika was coming from and why she made the decisions she made regarding the Shadow Tree, we first have to press pause on her story and talk about the people that she was seemingly so terrible to, an old civilization known only to us as the Hornsent. This people group is at the very center of the entire DLC. They make up several of the bosses, many of the various enemies scattered around the place, and are responsible for a good portion of the different environments we adventure through. Their entire civilization being burned away before their eyes is also a huge theme in the Shadow Realm, and their hatred for Queen Marika is apparent as nearly every statue of hers in the land is beheaded. However, even though at first glance you might feel sorry for these ill-fortuned folk, it isn't too far into the DLC that we're given a couple hints that there might be more to them than meets the eye. After meeting back up with Needle Knight Leda, she acknowledges that Queen Marika is the one who commanded Mesmer to purge the Tower Folk, aka the Hornsent, in fire, but immediately afterwards states that the Hornsent are by nature creatures of conquest, and therefore they are no saints. They just happened to be on the losing side of a war. And trust me, after we go over their many sins, you'll realize that they're about the farthest thing from being considered saints. They're a deeply religious and prideful people that believe themselves to be extremely special, a chosen race above all others, as proven by the horns that sprouts on their bodies, which they view as sublime artifacts and proof of their chosen nature. In fact, they believe that a super tangly horn is a symbol of primacy, or in other words, their positioning as the firstmost and greatest of all living races. This belief in the sanctity of horns stems from their worship of something called the Crucible. And for those who don't know what the Crucible is, let's talk about it for a second. The Crucible is a concept that's been around in Elden Ring since the release of the base game, but what exactly it is has always been a bit of a mystery. However, we do know some details, such as the fact that there are more than likely multiple Crucibles that each govern their own concepts that have existed throughout the history of the Lands Between, and that at least one of these Crucibles is the area or substance from which the Erdtree and most forms of life as we know it in the Lands Between originated. The real-life definition of the word Crucible could mean two things that more or less actually mean the same thing but in different contexts. Either it's a physical container within which elements are melted down and mixed together to form something different and new entirely, or it's a situation or trial within which different elements interact with one another and then form something new. But either way, the word Crucible essentially just means the creation of something new out of mixed elements by way of either a trial or being melted together. In Elden Ring, ancient Erdtree incantations describe the Crucible as the place where all life was once blended together, which does sound about right given its real-world definition. The Erdtree's Crucible is also referred to as primordial, which means something that existed at the beginning of time. Therefore, according to this lore, all life as we know it in the Lands Between was originally conjoined together and evolved from a Crucible. This Crucible is more than just a vague figment of history though. Having the genetic makeup for all forms of life also made it a source of great power, and it still is to this day, which we can see by encountering many different kinds of enemies such as the Crucible Knights, who literally use powerful Crucible evolutionary transformations as their attacks. And speaking of the Crucible Knights, the Crucible Tree Helm is also notably very horny. But you're probably wondering, this is all well and good, but what is a Crucible? Is it a location? Is it even something that's tangible? What is it made of? Or is it immaterial entirely? Well, this is partially speculative, but I personally believe that the Crucible that the Hornsent worship is a physical place, none other than the Gate of Divinity itself, and possibly even the entire tower known as Enir Ilum. This is for several reasons. Visually, we can obviously see that the Gate of Divinity is apparently made of bodies, mushed together into an almost pasty substance, seemingly petrified ages later when we the Tarnished explore the area. Even the tower itself appears to be made out of bodies, and what's more is that all of these bodies appear to be Hornsent. We also know that the Hornsent societies were based off of a class system, meaning there were both of those considered higher status and lower status, and therefore less valuable than others. And I can only assume that these bodies are in fact the lower class of the Hornsent. Furthermore though, Anir Ilum is also known as the Spiral Tower, and its many tower priests worship a force known as the Spiral, influencing many of the designs we can see around the tower and empowering many of the incantations learned in the Land of Shadow. And according to the incantation known as Spira, the spiral is blatantly a crucible current that they believed would one day form a column upwards to the realm of the gods. So, in my opinion, it would make sense if the Spiral Tower, which is associated with the spiral, which is a current of the crucible, which is a powerful substance gained from the melted together forms of life, is therefore the location of the crucible. Because remember that the crucible is known as the primordial form of the Erdtree, and the Gate of Divinity, which is an enormously powerful structure made out of a bunch of bodies that empowers spiral incantations, is also the place where Queen Marika created the Erdtree. And what I'm trying to say with all of this is that it's very possible that the Gate of Divinity literally is the crucible of the Erdtree, and it was most likely created by the Hornsent, who discovered somehow about the powers behind crucibles. But we'll come back to that later on in the video. No matter what you believe regarding the connections between the spiral and the crucible, the undeniable point here is that the Hornsent worship the crucible and its evolutionary ideals, and this is most likely why they value their horns. They view them as a sign of refinement and evolutionary progress above other normal humans. Like I mentioned earlier though, the Hornsent are clearly deeply religious, and this is why we encounter their tower festival activities firsthand in the form of the Divine Beast bosses and Divine Beast warriors. But in addition to worshipping the crucible and the spiral and the storm, these fanatics were also obsessed with forcing evolution on themselves in order to invoke transformations, which to them was the same as invoking divinity. Because of this, they were more than capable of harming others, as we've seen, or even themselves out of their zealous religious beliefs. They firmly believed in the importance of one's spirit more than one's physical body, which is why they could sacrifice a whole bunch of themselves to create the crucible, and is also what led to their firm resentment against the power of the frenzied flame. They even sealed it away within the body of Midra, because the flame of frenzy has the power to burn away both the body and the spirit, apparently without the need of the rune of death at all. Many of them would try to become what they referred to as tutelary deities, which means a protector deity, and for whatever reason they believed that living life as an ascetic, or in other words a severely self-disciplined monk, would achieve them spiritual refinement and therefore this tutelary deity status. These monks would even go so far as to literally take part in self-flagellating dances, aka dances where you physically inflict harm on yourself, as a part of their journey towards tutelarism. That's a fun word to say. In order to officially become one of these tutelary dudes though, you would have to eventually actually die out of this ascetic lifestyle, and afterwards your lifeless corpse would produce revered spirit ash in the palm of its hand, which accomplishes, I have no idea. There's nothing about how the Hornsent used revered spirit ash in the game. We the Tarnished can use it to make our mimic tier ashes stronger though, so that's pretty cool. While we don't know what the purpose of these tutelary dudes were and why there were so many Hornsent just dying to become one, we do know that there were ascetics who failed to go through with their tutelary transformations and stopped somewhere along the way, instead rebranding as curse blades and using their self-flagellating dances as attacks. Offensive flagellation. Although the prideful Hornsent saw the curse blades as dishonorable at first for abandoning their tutelary journey and imprisoned all of them, until they needed their help when Mesmer's forces laid siege to their lands. Not that it really helped all that much though. Now I know at this point we've talked about the crazy Hornsent quite a bit, and you're probably wondering when we're going to tie this back into Marika, who this video is actually about, so allow me to segue into our next chapter and subsequently the darkest part of the Hornsent history: their merciless enslavement, torture, and mass murder of the quiet, peaceful village of women known as the Shamans. Right off the bat, I want to specify what I mean when I say the word shaman, since the word is confusingly used to refer to two different groups of people in the English version of the DLC. Contrasting the word's use with the original Japanese version, though, provides some clarity for which is which. The first and most prevalent use of the word that I'll be referring to in this video would originally be miko, which is the word used for female shrine maidens or spirit mediums in real life. The second use of the word that I will not be referring to is kitoshi, which alternatively means a priest or medicine man or witch doctor. I'll explain why it's important to specify later on, but anyway, the shamans of the Land of Shadow were essentially a peaceful, village-dwelling tribe of women that we can only assume from their name were connected to things of a spiritual nature. And even though they're scarcely mentioned outright by name, their impact on the lands between is unparalleled. After progressing through the church district of Messmer's gigantic Shadow Keep, right before encountering King Bulbin from Twilight Princess riding in on an angry boar, if you look to the right of the Grace, you'll see a small hallway with a headless statue of Marika at the end, and one message written by an unknown author to an unknown recipient. The message reads, "Have mercy for the spirited away shamans." It's an intriguing setup, and you might think that's all there is to this hallway at first glance, but this statue holds a secret. If you use the "Oh Mother" gesture in front of it, it actually moves to the side, revealing a beautiful hidden land behind called the Hinterland. A short ways into the grassy, floral hinterland, we encountered two very familiar Erdtree Sentinel Knights, which seems strange that they'd be here, in the one land where the Erdtree's grace does not reach. But if you continue up the hill, you soon realize that they're here because they were protecting something, a small village known as Shaman Village, or Mikonomura in Japanese. As you approach and watch the doves fly by, you notice that it's quaint, pretty, and completely abandoned. You can also hear the music shift, revealing familiar chords on familiar strings. The theme of the Elden Ring, the theme of Marika, plays slowly in the background. Strangely, there's a minor Erdtree sprouting in the front of the village, giving off a glow of grace. This minor Erdtree represents only the kindness of gold, without order, and is known as a secret incantation of Queen Marika, who bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well that there was no one to heal. Meaning that not only is Shaman Village Marika's home, but she came back here after everyone was gone, and planted this minor Erdtree. If we then walk past the overgrown buildings, hiding in the hollow of a dead tree at the very end is a statue, where we can find something called the Golden Braid, which is a braid of golden hair that was cut loose and was Marika's offering to someone known as the Grandmother, who nobody knows the identity of for sure, but at the moment is assumedly either the village elder or a previous deity that the shamans worshipped. Aside from these two discoveries, Shaman Village is otherwise completely empty, leaving us with one burning question. What happened to the shamans? Fortunately, this is actually something that is somewhat explained in-game. See, throughout our adventure across the Land of Shadow, we're often given sly hints here and there about the sin of a place called Bonny Village. The many Greater Potentates cookbooks that we find claim that a Greater Potentate in particular was haunted by the grotesque practice of his village of birth. And in the eastern part of the map, a little way south from Shaman Village, we can actually find this Bonny Village. It's old, worn down, and chock full of giant jars, the kind of which we've seen before as living jars in the lands between. There are also many shadowy hornsent surrounding the area, as well as several other Greater Potentates, who are almost completely undressed except for wearing caterpillar masks on their faces, wielding extremely large Bonny butcher knives. Across a bridge leading away from Bonny Village, there's a hut known as the Whipping Hut, and it's here that we finally learn the dark secret of Bonny Village. There's a spirit here that we can listen to which says, "For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone." And within the hut is a weapon, a whip called the Tooth Whip, which is lined with rotten, misshapen teeth meant to not only inflict pain upon its victims, but also deadly poison that would cause the wounds to swell and ooze pus, loosening and liquefying the skin. The whip then says that the flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. This proves to us, in a dark twist, that the sin of Bonny Village is also the reason why Shaman Village is empty. Marika's people were abducted and tortured. mercilessly and turned into pustulent piles of flesh while they were still living and stuffed into jars by the terrible potentates of Bonnie Village. We can even see evidence of this atrocity firsthand in several jails, such as the nearby Bonnie jail, which is full of these living jars, the insides of which are still alive, and look somewhat similar to Marika herself, further proving the shaman connection. The reason why the Hornsent would do this to the peaceful shamans is once again attributed to their dark religious beliefs. In this case, those among themselves that they would condemn as sinners would be imprisoned and eventually punished and quote-unquote purified by being sliced up and stuffed into jars in order to become saints instead, which the Hornsent would then offer prayers to. And I can only assume they did this because of their worship of the crucible, wanting to create essentially smaller crucibles inside jars, filled with melded together flesh that would hopefully grant them divinity. And shamans were involved simply because the flesh of shamans was said to meld well with the flesh of the condemned. And I'm not sure if that means they melded well spiritually or physically, but regardless, the Hornsent viewed this as the shaman's sole purpose for even existing. Also, as a side note, you'll notice that the living jars of the Shadow Realm are notably more bluish gray in appearance as opposed to their tan gold colored counterparts in the Lands Between. And I believe this is intentional in order to differentiate the two from one another. The Lands Between living jars are filled with the already deceased remains of warriors, and even though that's kind of gross, they're also strangely kind of wholesome. And for proof of that, just check out my Warrior Jar Alexander video and take it from me, you might need to bring a box of tissues. But back to Marika's backstory. At long last, you finally know why Marika hated the Hornsent so much for what they did to her people. So eventually, she decided to do something about it. Marika did not want to simply kill those who did her and her people harm. That would be way too easy. No, she wanted to erase them entirely, while also ensuring that they would feel this pain and punishment forever. At this point, unfortunately, after reading through the entire text dumps of both the DLC and the base game, Marika's specific actions and timeline is still shrouded in lots of mystery. But I'll tell you the information given to us in-game and interpret it in the way that makes the most logical sense to me. I believe that at this point, Marika, who was apparently being guided and instructed on what to do by either her own two fingers or the Mother of Fingers herself, first and foremost gathered a large number of people willing to fight for her, who might have even been a few Crucible Knights led by Godfrey, whom she would marry. She then decided to ascend the Spiral Tower and use the Hornsent's Crucible against them, using the Gate of Divinity to become a god herself and create the Golden Order, as well as the Erdtree and the Shadow Tree, which I believe were created simultaneously since they are both two sides of Marika's grace, and the Shadow Tree is literally said to be the Erdtree's shadow, simultaneously bathing the part of the world she wished to rule in the light of her grace and cloaking the lands of the Hornsent in shadow, locked away from her grace and the rest of the world. She then sealed the tower away in shadowy thorns, stemming from something called the Sealing Tree, using her new godlike powers. It's also possible that the Sealing Tree and subsequently the shadowy thorns are extensions of the Shadow Tree itself, since thorns are a part of the Shadow Tree, but that's neither here nor there. Due to a lot of deep lore that I go over in the Mikla video, I personally believe that one must be a god in order to create an Erdtree, which is referred to as being divine, which is why all of this happened at the same time. We also know that in creating the Golden Order, Marika sealed away the Rune of Death, also known as Destined Death, which I believe was solely so that she could subject the Hornsent to an eternal banishment from which they could never escape through death. However, the Rune of Death, as you'll recall, was actually in the possession of a rival god-slaying Empyrean at this time who was known as the Gloam-Eyed Queen, who might have even been the previous god before Marika, and Marika ended up sicking her half-wolf shadow, Malekith, on the Gloam-Eyed Queen in order to defeat her and claim the Rune of Death, after which he was tasked with its safekeeping. I go into this in much more detail in my previous video covering 11 unsolved mysteries in Elden Ring, but I'll mention here that I also believe it's a strong possibility that Destined Death itself is an outer god that the Gloam-Eyed Queen served as its god, which is why the rune of the Gloam-Eyed Queen was the Rune of Death. But like I mentioned, that's purely speculative. Marika then decided to wage war against the now immortal Hornsent, led by her son Messmer the Impaler and his own army. Upon her exaltation to godhood, she was even able to raise her son to demigod status, which granted him the iconic Flames of Messmer, with which to purge the lands of the Hornsent in fire, doomed to burn eternally. It's heavily implied that Mesmer is Marika's firstborn child, but unfortunately there's no mention of who his father might be. We have guesses, such as his red hair, which given his fire powers and his apparent affiliation with the fell god of fire, seems to imply there might have been a little something going on between Marika and the previous god, which might have been the fell god of fire, which she may have seduced and betrayed. But that's just another theory. We do also know that Mesmer had a little sister who is more than likely Melina herself, either with this same father or a different one, which means that Marika more than likely had kids with no fewer than 3 different gentleman suitors. This is further spoken to by the old Hornsent lady known as Hornsent Grandam, who insultingly refers to Marika as a strumpet, which is Old English speak for someone, particularly a female, who sleeps around a lot, essentially more or less calling her a prostitute. And by the way, the Hornsent Grandam was also an Empyrean, like Marika herself, meaning she was a rival to Marika and a powerful individual capable of achieving godhood herself. But we'll come back to her in just a second. To say the least, Mesmer was extremely good at his job, and mercilessly purged the Hornsent from their homes and castles all over the land, commanding his army from his fortress known as Shadowkeep. In the basement of Shadowkeep, though, we actually discover that Mesmer was also trying to either heal or reverse the plight of his mother's people, the shamans. We can see what looks to be an infirmary, with many hospital beds and jars all around, including their innards. How successful this venture was is unknown, but I would assume he was not very successful at all, given it's been an unknown amount of centuries that have passed, and there are still enormous piles of meat lying around, and the still living jars are still walking through the halls. Even still, though, his efforts here and his good relationship with several members of his army, including the loyalty of R'hllana, little sister of Rennala, speaks volumes about the character of Mesmer. But back to his war. The Hornsent put up whatever fight they could muster, not only utilizing their powerful Crucible warriors, but also unleashing the imprisoned Curse Blades back into the world and turning their Divine Beast dancers into monstrous fighters to fight against Mesmer. But when Mesmer's forces continued to decimate the Hornsent army, even going so far as to impale their sacred Divine Beasts upon spears to be burned away, which was viewed as an extremely severe act of blasphemy against the Hornsent and everything they held sacred, this is when the rival Empyrean, the Hornsent Grandam, decided to hit Marika back where it hurts the most, by cursing her children, each and all, with an omen. I believe that this is when Mesmer was afflicted with the base serpent, which Marika sealed behind his eye with a replacement eye that doubled as a seal of her own grace out of fear of the serpent's dark power. As a reminder, serpents are seen as traitors to the Erdtree, meaning it's likely that the base serpent residing within Mesmer has something to do either with that or because of that, which would make the fact that Grandam cursed Marika's son with a demonic snake all the more insulting. It's also possible that the Hornsent Grandam is none other than the Gloam-eyed Queen, whom Marika had to defeat in order to reclaim the Rune of Death. Finger Reader Enya in the Round Table Hold even refers to the rune as the Forbidden Shadow, which could imply that it came from the Land of Shadow, but again, this is speculative. At this point, a darkness began to grow within Marika that stemmed from her intense hatred of the Hornsent, and she then decided to take this war one step further and abandon it, leaving the Realm of Shadow behind, inaccessible from the outside world, including her own cursed son, Mesmer the Impaler, who would steadfastly continue forward with his duty of ridding the world of those his mother removed from grace, until the very day we find and slay him and the base serpent residing inside. His last words spoken are a curse against his mother Marika, a chilling irony of the very reason she abandoned her own son. But before she left, she returned once more to her home village to plant a minor Erdtree as a symbol, and leave her golden braid at the statue inside the dead tree, honoring the grandmother. I also believe that it's at this point that she uttered her prayer, which the golden braid alludes to. I believe that Marika's prayer is the very same unmarked message in front of the mysterious Marika statue. Have mercy for the spirited away shamans. She also left 2 of her sentinels to guard the village, which they patrol to this day. As a side note, I'll be going over the reasons for believing this much more in an upcoming video covering the secret of the town of Celia, but I personally believe that the Nox are the same as the Newmen, or at least were at one point. And as a reminder, the Newmen are Marika's people. And now that Shadow of the Erdtree has released, we know that this must mean that the shamans of Shaman Village are the same as the Newmen as well, and therefore by extension the Nox themselves, which heavily implies that Marika was actually able to rescue some of the shamans. But again, more on that in an upcoming video. After Marika left the Shadow Realm and her son behind for good, the rest is history, and we know Marika's story after these events due to the lore of the original game. However, Marika's troubles were far from over. Even though she married the leader of her own sect of Crucible Knights, a powerful warrior known as Godfrey, the Grandam's curse would follow her through each of her children, starting with her twins Moog and Morgott, who were both afflicted with the twisted horns of the Horn-Sent people, referred to as the Omen. Since Miquella was able to even use Moog's Omen curse in order to breach Marika's seal and enter the land of the Horn-Sent, we know now that the curse of the Omen is undoubtedly connected to Horn-Sent Grandam's curse, which she also calls an omen. And because of this, Marika would lock away her own 2 children from the time of their birth. Her next 2 children, another set of twins, Miquella and Melania, would also end up afflicted with their own curses. But among all of her children, there was one that was unaffected, unafflicted, good and kind, Godwyn, known as the Golden, Marika's pride and joy. It's no wonder then that Godwyn's murder at the hands of her stepdaughter Ranni the Witch would push Marika over the edge and lead her to shatter the Elden Ring itself. But with that said, that wraps up the backstory of Queen Marika the Eternal, who spent her life achieving godhood and defying all others who would try to stop her. I know I covered a lot of ground in this one, and there's still so much mystery surrounding Marika, so please, if you have a different interpretation of the lore findings discussed in this video, let me know all about them in the comments below. And here's a primer question for you. What do you think Marika's seduction and betrayal was as alluded to in the trailer? And seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story breakdown, please consider leaving a like, as that greatly helps spread this video around on the platform, and they take a lot of time to create. And subscribe if you haven't already for much more Elden Ring lore, brought to you in a very simple, very understandable way. Huge thanks as always to my bandit crew for their ongoing support, who make my day every single day, and seriously are the reason I create the videos I love creating for you guys. Be sure to keep up to date with me on my socials, and that's all she wrote. This is Bandit, looking forward to seeing you in the next video, and signing out. Peace!